A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 13. In the library's History of Medicine room, Fergus, at first scarcely glancing at the title, author, date, or binding of the book, scanned the table of contents and opened immediately to Chapter 7, which was entitled The Stonehead Syndrome, a diagnostic puzzle. The chapter itself was a section from a journal beginning with a place name and date. Ayucalpa, Peru, September 15, 1936. We had resolved, if time permitted, to make from this village population 81, altitude 3,850 meters, a side excursion to the so-called Stonehead community described by Cesar Diaz Rodriguez in his account of his expedition of 1849. This portion of his book has been, as we noted earlier, largely discredited, since it was to this area that he claimed to have traced the Inca Toltec treasure. Having raised funds from associates to retrieve it, he absconded with the money. Yet, sections of his account, those having nothing to do with treasure, are told in convincingly vivid detail, and these details are of such a nature as to make at least a quick investigation seem germane to our medical research. In Ayucalpa, therefore, we inquired to the local citizenry the whereabouts of the statue, the stone mansion, the huts, and the waterfall described by Diaz Rodriguez. Fergus in disappointment stopped reading. He had been excited to find any medical reference to Steinkampf or Stonehead. Now he realized that it had been too much to expect. There was a similarity in nomenclature, but it was merely coincidental. What could this book, apparently about medical research in Peru, have to do with Dr. Schutz? He looked at the title page. A Survey of Medical and Biological Aspects of High-Altitude Environment in the Peruvian Andes. Volume 2, Expedition of 1935-1936, a continuing investigation into the effects of prolonged hypoxia on human respiratory and neurological systems at elevations exceeding 3,000 meters, by Heinrich von Bülow, Professor of Medical Studies, University of Göttingen. Fergus thought, a typical Teutonic title, thorough and forbidding. The second and third pages of the book, solid with fine, dull print, were entitled Acknowledgements. He glanced at them, spotted the name Diaz Rodriguez again, and read, "We were frequently dependent on the work of Peruvian explorer Cesar Diaz Rodriguez, whose maps, sketches, and geological records we found generally reliable. In many cases, they constituted the only information available on these remote, inaccessible, and inhospitable Andean valleys." And then, from a paragraph 2 inches farther down the page, the name leaped out at him. Acknowledgement and appreciation are also due to the Laboratory of Biological Sciences in Berlin, and especially to Dr. Bernhard Vollrath and Dr. Helmut Schutz for their prompt and painstaking analytical studies and evaluation of material brought back from the field, including tissue sections, viral and bacteriological cultures, soil and water samples, and others. Such analysis in a fully equipped laboratory were, as always, essential to confirm and correct findings made with necessarily cruder equipment in the field. They are continuing as this account of the fieldwork is written. We wish to express thanks to the clerical and secretarial staffs of the School of Medicine, University of Göttingen, for their assistance in preparing. Ferguson returned to Chapter 7, his opinion abruptly reversed. That there could be two Steinkampfs was a plausible coincidence. That there could be two Steinkampfs both connected with Dr. Helmut Schutz was not. He read on. To our surprise, we found the natives of Ayucalpa, Indians speaking a dialect of Quechua and very Spanish, totally, one might even say determinedly, uninformed about the subjects often described. They seemed unaware of the existence of another valley to the west of their own. When we asked about a stone head, the village chief first looked blank, then, with 2 other men, led us east, the wrong direction, to a hilltop where there stood a stone statue of Christ, arms outstretched over the valley, not at all similar to what Diaz Rodriguez had described. For the benefit of those not familiar with what he did describe, it would perhaps be permissible to quote briefly from that portion of his book. The book, his second published work, entitled The Exploration of the Peruvian Andes, was kept in the form of a log. The entries in question cover 2 days, June 28th through 29th, 1849. At this point, Diaz Rodriguez was apparently traveling alone. One of his Indian bearers having died, the other deserted. He had been 7 months in the field. The weather had turned cold. He could not record temperatures, his thermometer having been broken earlier, but he told of keeping his water canteen near the fire to prevent its freezing at night. He wrote, I awoke at sunrise near the village of Ayukalpa, where I purchased food and replenished my water supply. Here I heard again about the valley I was seeking. After many disappointments, I have learned not to trust the stories told by the natives in these high mountain villages, for they are all illiterate, superstitious, and, because of the thinness of the air, they are given to hallucinations and visions which they believe are real. Accounts of this valley, however, were particularly consistent, almost always involving the word stone. Its people were ruled by a chief known as the Stone King, or sometimes King of Stones. Their god was a stone god of fearsome proportions. The king, who was also a priest of the stone god, lived in a great palace made entirely of shining white stones. The king himself was immortal, a descendant of immortals. He possessed magical powers over his subjects so that they obeyed his commands before they were even spoken. He could also, when he chose, make the earth tremble and move underfoot, and cause waterfalls to appear where none had been before. Powers, it may be noted, also often attributed to the Incas. In the past, when I had asked where this valley might be found, the reply had always been indefinite, most often a gesture, a waving of the arm toward higher peaks to the west. But in Ayukalpa, for the first time, I was offered what seemed to be specific knowledge. The valley, I was told, lay straight toward the sunset behind a ridge of snow peaks, plainly visible from the village. How far? I asked the headman. Half a day, he said. A day. Two will come with me as guides. It will be faster. The headman looked away. It cannot be done today, he said. Other men of the village, who had been crowded close listening, drew back. There is manioc to harvest. Too much work. By no amount of arguing, threatening, or bribery, though indeed I had little left to bribe with, could I persuade any of them to accompany me. The headman appeared increasingly uneasy at the discussion. As for the others, they had all disappeared into the dark doorways of their windowless huts. Do you fear the people of this valley? I asked firmly. No, said the headman. Once we feared them, but no more. They do not come out. No one sees them. Still, we do not go to their valley. If no one sees them, I asked, how do you know they are still there? I began to suspect another fantasy. They are there, he replied. They do not come out, but they are there. That was all the assurance I could get from him. In the end, Professor Bonvulo's text continued. Diaz Rodriguez went alone. Thus, there were no witnesses to confirm the strange sights and bizarre events he claimed to have seen. The countryside he crossed was typical of the bleak terrain of the high Andes. The cold desert, called the Altiplano, gray-brown, dry, rocky, uneven, difficult to walk on. The only flora, a coarse moss-like lichen that grows thickly on the stones, making them appear twice or even 10 times as large as they are. In high wind, its fibers ripple like grasses, giving the bleak plain the look of a lake in a squall. The inner layers of these lichens turn dense and fibrous, like dry sponge or peat. The natives burn them for fuel, chopping off brick-sized chunks with their machetes, or use them as building material to chink their stone huts. Uncertain of his route, forced to detour twice by deep crevices in the cracked and convoluted terrain, Diaz Rodriguez spent most of the day reaching the ridge of the mountains behind which the valley lay, a distance he estimated at 8 to 10 miles. It was almost sunset before he found a pass leading in, and came on the first of a series of astonishing sights. The pass was narrow, between sheer walls of rock that rose on either side to 200 feet or more. The effect was that of a tunnel, its stone floor leading downward into the mountain. After 10 minutes, his watch too was broken. He found his progress blocked by a very large round boulder. He thought he would have to go back, but then, in the dim light, he saw there was a narrow opening on one side, a mere 10 inches, so close that he had to squeeze against the stone. When he did, he was astonished to find that it was polished as smooth as glass. It was not a natural boulder, but a carved stone sphere. The cleft curved around it, and when he had squeezed forward a few feet, he saw ahead of him, shining in his eyes, a brilliant orange light. It was the setting sun, as he had come through the heart of the mountain into the valley. In his own words, I gazed now upon a most astounding spectacle, which lay both before and behind me. Ahead was the valley, green and fair by contrast, with the grim rock desert I had left outside. It was well watered by two streams which flowed from the snow peaks above. Directly ahead of me on the far side of the valley, one of them hurled itself from a cliff top to form a tall waterfall of silver and white. On the same hillside as the waterfall, but farther to my left, stood the castle. It was square of shape, massive, of simple yet elegant architecture, its roof straight except at the center, where a tower rose like a four-sided steeple. It looked large enough to house 100 people, yet exquisite despite its size, for it was made, as the Indians had said, of white stone. It was surrounded by a wall of the same stone, and from a gate in this wall a road led down into the valley. Along the road stood a score of smaller houses, also of stone, but with thatched roofs. All this I observed from the niche where I stood beside the stone sphere. Then I walked forward a few paces, looked back to assure that I would be able to find my way out, and I was gazing on the stone god. The boulder I had walked around, lit by the setting sun, was magnificently carved in the shape of a human face, 20 feet from chin to brow, a somber face with a strangely oriental look. There is no need, von Bülow's account continued, to quote further from Diaz Rodriguez's increasingly excited and detailed descriptions of the sight he saw as he made his way down the hillside into the valley. What we have already quoted is sufficient to identify the sight: the large carved stone head, two streams, a waterfall, and a substantial structure of white stone. More important to us as medical researchers was his discovery as he entered the small community of stone houses. The entire population, with a single exception, was dead. There were 112 bodies, a few of them infants, small children, and very old people. He found in the houses, each of which he entered, and all of which he noted were uniformly clean and orderly, but most of them, he counted 91, had died in a group, seated in rows as if at a theater or attending a religious ceremony, all facing the gate and the wall surrounding the great white castle. The area where they sat was a grassy semicircle, a small park which looked as if it had been designed for such an assembly. Just outside the gate, awaiting a speaker or priest, stood a podium of stone. The gate itself, of heavy dark wood, was shut. Diaz Rodriguez, though not trained in medicine, was nonetheless curious as to what could have caused the disaster. He suspected some swift and deadly disease which had struck them as they sat, so sudden in its action that they had no chance to arise. Even those bodies that had fallen on their sides still remained bent at the hips and knees as if seated. He did not, for fear of contagion, examine them closely, but from a distance of a few feet no sign of any disease was visible. Their faces were without exception calm and in repose, almost as if they had died in sleep. Two things he did notice. They looked extremely emaciated, as if they had not eaten for a long period, and their lips and mouths were gray and cracked, as if they had had no water to drink. This was puzzling to the extreme, for on the way down the mountainside, Diaz Rodriguez had marveled at the richness and abundance of the crops awaiting harvest in the terraced gardens: maize, potatoes, squash, beans, peas, and more. As for water, one of the mountain streams, as is customary in Andes villages, had been diverted in a stone aqueduct so that it gushed through the center of town. How could the people have lacked plenty, both of food and water? Diaz Rodriguez, by his own admission, felt increasingly oppressed and frightened by the presence of death, the silence broken only by the sound of the waterfall, a sense of danger. Whatever sinister agent had struck these people down might at any moment also strike him, yet he could not bring himself to leave without entering the castle. It was there he found the valley's only living inhabitant. We may omit here his awestruck description of the castle's interior, the magnificent proportions of its chambers, the massive austerity of its stone and wood furnishings, contrasting with rugs of the softest vicuna. He entered without difficulty. Neither gate nor doors were locked. After I had explored the third room, he wrote, still marveling as I went, I heard a sound, a faint sighing call. I was filled with fear, for I had believed all to be dead and myself alone. It came again. It was a voice barely audible, calling in Spanish, summoning me to come. Ahead, a small stone stairway, 4 steps only, led to a door. The sound came from behind it. Cautiously I climbed the stair. Carefully I opened the door, ready to leap back and run. Inside, on a very large wooden bed, but in great disorder, lay an old man. He was as frail as a skeleton, his hair only a few strands of white, his face and hands dark and wrinkled. He seemed unable to rise, but his eyes were bright. You are a stranger, he said. You come from outside. He spoke as if he had been expecting me. His language was the Spanish of an educated man. Yes, I said, only an hour ago. You must speak to the people, he said. I can no longer walk to the gate. They are all dead. His eyes closed, and he lay a long time silence. Finally, he spoke again. All dead? Are they at the gate? He did not wait for me to answer. It is what I feared. You have come too late, too late. Is it a plague? No plague, he said. They have starved. He opened his eyes again. You need not fear a plague. Only do not drink the water from their stream. Fergus paused. He opened his briefcase and took from it the notebook and the ballpoint pen. Then he read on, taking notes as he turned the pages. And that is the end of chapter 13.